So all over this country this morning, the Old Testament reading, the beginnings of Israel, will be read in churches. And there is a kind of symbiotic connection, a fascination for Americans with the story of Israel, both from the Old Testament and up to the present day. And it's almost that our own sense of identity and security and belonging, that Israel is a kind of crucible, something that we are connected to. Their story is 2,700 years old. This story was written a long time ago, and our story is 10% of that. But there is a connection that I want to explore this morning. And the first verse in that Julia Childs, you cleaned it up a little, but it's still pretty violent, and it's a God that we find difficult to get our heads around. That's not the God, the Father of Jesus, but yet it is a part of this story, and it's very interesting how the author of the first couple of books in the Bible, 2,700 years ago, had the enormous task of weaving together seemingly conflicting ideas of God and an understanding of what it meant to be the people of God. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But I wanted to focus on the first verse that was read today, because God is commanding this disparate slave people. There's no national anthem. There is no flag to rally around. Instead, he says, today is the beginning of time for you. And that the identity of the children of Israel is intimately connected with this moment. That all time and identity begins for you now. And then they outline this very specific ritual, which again to our ears might seem strange and violent. And it's weaving together at twilight. There is a moment where these slave people will know the signal to have this ritual where they are connected as a people for the first time. And they slaughter this lamb, they put the blood on the lintels. There is this image of God wearing down the Egyptian state in a series of disasters, so that the nation is exhausted and they finally let this people go. And there is in older, more primitive traditions, and even up to the present day, in Africa, for example, the sacrifice of an animal, if there are warring parties, families are in conflict, often the reconciliation is celebrated by the slaughter of an animal. And the blood is kind of shared between often the tribal leaders. And then that animal is cooked as a feast to celebrate. And part of that kind of covenant is that what we have done to this animal will be done to you if you don't keep this agreement. So it's really about a covenant, a reconciliation that is still very much a part of more primitive societies' ways of dealing with conflict and violence. But it sounds strange to us. But the author of these early books in the Bible had to take that violent, sacrificial God, and it had to take the traditions of the shepherds. The shepherds would have sacrificed their firstborn lamb, and the farmers would have brought their sheaf of wheat, and it was the tradition when the temple was standing to offer the first fruits of the harvest to the priest to sacrifice. So what was very interesting about the creation of this liturgy was that the author wove together these difficult texts. The farmers and the shepherds would be needed in the new nation. So they're linked together in this feast, the unleavened bread and the lamb. And what's really, really masterful about this process is he takes something that's ugly and violent, and by the end of it, it is about the celebration of God liberating a people. It's about a compassionate God. The violent God is transformed into a God of compassion that listens to the voices of the marginalized. And it's a remarkable achievement. You know, Cam and I create liturgies. It's kind of our job. But this liturgy is remarkable because it has been celebrated in different stages, different eras, different things, and it's meant something enormously powerful to the Jewish people. And if you go to a Seder today, a modern Seder, there is this moment where the suffering and the liberation of God's people in Egypt is also our responsibility today. It's not just something that happened in the past, but it's happening now. Where in the world do people need to be liberated from oppression and injustice? And so we, as Americans, we are fascinated by this story. And I want to reflect a moment about that first verse, go back to that first verse, because the identity issue begins with the acknowledgement of time. And time becomes this remarkable way in which the children of Israel are first gathered together. And what is that about, and how can that speak to us today? There is, in the 19th century, there was a fascination in this country with time. It was clocks and watches were being developed. The beginning of industrialization in this country largely came out of our fascination with time. And we needed to know accurate time to join the country together with the railways. We needed to measure time so that people could turn up to work and do a day's work and so on. And there's a wonderful book by Thomas Allen that talks about this importance of time in the 19th century and how that idea of the future, that America was somehow connected, there was a destiny in America, and its roots come from Locke's treatise on government. So 100 years before the Revolution, Locke was talking about this America, this future where people would evolve liberty and equality and protection, and this idea would go forward into the future. And that was very much, that colored the creators of the Republic, people like Jefferson, who saw the identity of this new emerging nation being connected to time. What conflicted with that concept was the idea of space or territory. And I want us to think about how the relationship between identity and time and space is very much a conversation that's going on today. And it's also a conversation that is as old as the Republic itself. And by space, I mean when, for instance, when the Louisiana Purchase was made, or when the American government and American people began moving west, there were people who said, well, this isn't really about what it means to protect liberty if we're taking over peoples and land and countries. This is in conflict with this idea that we are a people of time, that we have something to look forward to. And so the idea of the conflict between time and space becomes very much a part of the conversation. And I was thinking about that today. A lot of conversations around building walls. The 800,000 young people that were part of DACA, that all of a sudden, who knows what that's going to be. But that, in its essence, is a conversation about space, right? And you have this, and so it doesn't matter who's the president or who's in the administration. This is a conversation that's been going on in this country for 300 years. And we have to figure out how we balance it, how we kind of move forward in it. And it's interesting that the issue of space and time is also important to Israel as a state. The American taxpayer right now, we are committing $38 billion over the next 10 years for the security of Israel. And that was under the Obama administration. And when Susan Rice signed that agreement, basically she said, America's security is tied up with Israel's security. And I go back to the story that we read this morning. And how our identity and our values, that Israel is a kind of crucible that Americans are fascinated with. And how do we move forward? How do we have those difficult conversations? And part of the conversation is also going on between Silicon Valley, who's saying that our economy depends on people coming from outside the United States. This is where ingenuity and idea, and that's a conversation about time and future. It is the battle between ideas that America is bigger than just territory and space. And so I found it really helpful in this book about time in the 19th century to kind of figure out what's going on today and what is our place in that. Some recent work in American studies in a secular way is creating a similar crossing of ideas of American space, territory, and time. And Thomas Allen's book talks about these new developments that move us beyond the paradigm of nationhood by investigating transnational or post-national spaces. And he talks about borderlands such as the Southwest, or nations who share in the Atlantic or the Pacific rims. And there's a guy called John Carlos Rowe who argues that American studies must spend more time looking at what he calls these contact zones, defined as the liminal region or border zone in which different cultures meet. The role played by territorialized or extraterritorialized people is an important next stage in the development of America. And I want to kind of connect in some old wisdom from Jesus, that to love your neighbor as you love yourself is a way in which the time and space issues are crossed, literally crossed. If you love your neighbor, then you respect your neighbor's space. And you will not covet your neighbor. You will not exploit your neighbor economically or sexually. So the connection to love your neighbor is an important conversation that the Christian community needs to, we need to engage in. The reading in Matthew's Gospel is a kind of early ways in which this community that was trying to live differently, to live with the tension between space and time, the way in which they were going to work out conflict. And it's an early mediation. Some of you do mediation professionally. So this was a 2,000-year-old model of what happens when spaces and privacy and one's own being is somehow violated. And how does the community work that out? So I want to close by looking at the altar and what we just did today with the children. And a way in which the author of this amazing liturgy that we read about in the Old Testament, in a way we need somebody like that to create a liturgy today that pulls together all of the pieces of who we are. And the altar, it's interesting, the altar is a place of sacrifice. It's interesting that in the church, we haven't kind of sanitized. There's still language in our liturgy of sacrifice, right? Jesus, the blood of Jesus is sacrificed for the sins of the world. and we keep this altar. But it's interesting how in Christianity, look what we did this morning. We took something that was about violence and bloodshed, and we laid on that ways and gifts and sacrifice that can transform and heal God's world through love. So I hope that as we struggle and look at the issues before us today, I mean, what I found really helpful about the lessons today, so much of what's going on in our country has been personalized. This is an old conversation, and it takes on different clothes and faces. But it's really important as Christians that we stand up and say, you know, we follow the man who says, love your neighbor as you love yourself. And that the combination of space and time is transformed by that cross. Amen.